So I start each one of these videos before I start talking with a graphic, which sadly I don't remember who to give credit to for that graphic at the moment, but I will remember and give that credit at some point. But it's the truth versus perspective graphic, and it shows, a circle with a dot looking at it, and from that one perspective you can only see part of it. It's only when you see the full perspective, right, when you get the full circle, that you can get to the truth of a matter. And truth is a funny thing. Some things in life there is a true objective truth. In other cases, it feels like more of like an aggregation of different things that comes together to be kind of a complicated, nuanced truth. But I think the point is the same regardless. It's trying to step outside of your traditional or normal perspective and try and see things from different angles, from somebody else's perspective, or just from a different angle or a different side. And I believe that's always a good thing. I think it sometimes gets confused with the idea that seeing something from a different perspective or a different angle means that you have to abandon your beliefs or your views. But I am a strong believer that that is not the case. It's to have that information. More information is always better. And I've talked about this before in a number of videos, but the fear of seeing things from a different perspective often comes from this idea of maybe I'm not right. And rather than actually know that, which would seem like the obvious thing, I'd rather know if I'm wrong. I'd rather know if there's a true objective truth that I'm not seeing yet. There's this illogical view of I'd rather just stay safe and not know what's over there or see it from that angle. I'd rather just stick in my lane where it feels comfortable. And I get it. There's reasons for that, but I bring that up because I in conversation today I came across an example which maybe highlights the importance and an illustration of perspective versus objective truth pretty well. So context being, as I've been talking about for most of the last week or so, racism topic in America. Obviously a lot of protests and all that going on. And I'd mentioned in a prior video the Drew Brees situation. So Drew Brees, being a quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, made some comments on a radio show or a podcast, more or less saying that he would never agree with anybody that kneels in front of the flag or for the national anthem, whatever it was, because he had grandfathers that fought in the war, and he just thinks about their sacrifice and respects it too much. And I went into all the details of that, and the net of it is he took a lot of heat from some players in the league, some teammates. I don't know if it went as far as like brands and companies, but it was certainly heading down a path where many public figures weren't happy with those comments. They felt like they were a little bit tone deaf, they were a little insensitive given the current situation, and Drew Brees ultimately apologized. I think a couple times. His wife also came out, I believe, and apologized, and he spoke on it and tried to clarify his comments, and understanding that perhaps it wasn't the right time to make those comments, etc. What's interesting about it is I've heard from a lot of people, or a good amount of people, that are angry that he apologized, mainly because they felt like he was forced into apologizing, because he took so much heat and there was so much pressure on him that it was almost a form of censorship, and that they threatened, him in some ways to force him into an apology. And, my response to that led me to this perspective versus truth point, because as I thought about that more and I tried to understand that perspective, and I think it was my brother that actually said it to me at one point, nobody actually made him apologize. He chose to apologize. Now, was there pressure towards that? Sure. But ultimately, it was his decision. He didn't get arrested. He didn't get fined. He didn't break the law. He said something that people didn't like, and they responded. In some ways, that's kind of the perfect kind of market perspective on it and how it should play out. You have the right to say whatever you want, but other people have the right to respond. And if people don't like it, they could speak out against you. If companies don't like it, they could say, we don't want you to be a sponsor for us, or we don't want to do business with you anymore. Or if a team doesn't like it, they could cut them. And that kind of gets back to the point, right? People would say, well, yeah, sure, there was no legal penalty, but all of those pressures I just mentioned, the businesses, the team, other public figures, all that pressure they put, it's in effect a form of censorship, and that's not okay. He shouldn't have had to apologize for that. He didn't say anything wrong. It's his right to say what he believes. So that concept of it feels wrong to them. And I would argue that's the perspective piece of the graphic, right? Because from that perspective, you agreed with what Drew Brees said. You're uncomfortable with the idea that somebody else or group or people didn't like it, and they expressed that, and that led to him changing his actions. So I would argue that's the perspective piece, right? Because if you take it and you look at it, you could make an argument, I think a pretty strong one, that you can't be upset about the Drew Brees situation and then be okay with the Colin Kaepernick situation, because in many ways they are so similar, right? If you look at it, the fear with Drew Brees was he said something, which was fine for him to say, but there was a backlash to it. And because of that backlash, he apologized to avoid any, destruction of his livelihood, losing his job, losing his sponsorships, losing friends, what have you. His choice. Colin Kaepernick, in many ways, went through the same thing. He said something people didn't like. In his case, there were some actions involved, but in effect, it was the statements he was making, that he was trying to speak out on police brutality and he was kneeling during the national anthem to do that, etc. People didn't like that. He did not apologize. The repercussions came in, that perfect market we talk about, right? He did not get a job in the NFL anymore. He perhaps lost some business, and he lost some friends, I'm sure, and many people would say he was blackballed from the NFL. He was willing to suffer those consequences and went forward with it. Arguably, Drew Brees could have done the same. And, much like with Colin Kaepernick, he got a sponsorship deal from Nike, and other businesses that did support his cause stepped in and did that, which may have happened with Drew Brees. The point being, the situations are very, very similar. So the perspective versus truth, the only difference for the person that looks at the Drew Brees situation and says, this is wrong, right? That perspective, this is wrong. They censored him. This is not the way to do it. The only difference between the Drew Brees situation and the Colin Kaepernick situation is you didn't like what Colin Kaepernick said. You liked what Drew Brees said. So it's that perspective, right? It's just your perspective that's making you think something rather than seeing the actual truth, which is if you believe in the First Amendment, if you believe in freedom of speech, you have to be okay with both of them. You may not agree with the sentiment. You may not agree with either of the sentiments. You may agree with both. Doesn't matter. The point is you have to be consistent. That's that objective truth. You pick a framework. You pick something of how you assess these situations. If somebody says something and it's not hurting anybody, they should be allowed to say it. There should be no backlash. Great. Drew Brees should have been able to say what he said with no backlash. But so should Colin Kaepernick. If you were okay with Colin Kaepernick getting blackballed by the NFL, then you almost have to, in a math type equation, right? The two things have to be equal. You have to be okay with Drew Brees taking the backlash he did. And again, they each made their decisions of how they wanted to handle it. I certainly welcome, pushback on this. It seems, I recognize as I'm making this video that perhaps more than most videos, I feel confident in this view. I just said it's almost a math equation that the two things have to be equal. I check my instruments, right? I try and practice what I preach. When I feel that confident, I am aware that maybe I'm buying into my own story here too much and I'm missing something. I don't think I am. I think I'm thinking about it, completely, but perhaps I am. So I'm open to that idea. Perhaps there are some other nuance or complexities in those two situations that do make them different, but they feel very similar. And again, they feel like a great illustration of how you can look at something from your perspective and think you see it and you understand it fully, but you really don't until you step out and look at the whole picture and really get to that objective truth.